In this 1900 photograph of a mother and son, his gaze hides a silent secret. The photograph sits in a leather portfolio, brittle at the edges, sepia-toned and formal. Boston, Massachusetts, October 1900. A mother and son pose in a studio on Tremont Street, surrounded by painted backdrops of ivy and columns meant to suggest prosperity. She wears a high-necked dress with delicate lace at the collar, her hair pulled back severely. Her hand rests on the boy's shoulder, not lightly, but with the grip of someone holding on to something precious that might slip away. The boy is perhaps 14, maybe 15. He wears a wool suit too heavy for the season, his collar starched stiff. But it's his eyes that arrest anyone who studies the photograph, while his mother stares directly at the camera with the stoic determination expected of women in 1900. The boy's gaze drifts slightly to the left, unfocused, as if he's looking at something beyond the studio walls, something the rest of the world cannot see. In 2024, an estate appraiser named Thomas Bennett discovered this photograph in a trunk at an auction house in Salem. He was cataloging items from the demolished Hawthorne Street apartment building, one of Boston's oldest residential structures, finally giving way to modern development. Most of the contents were unremarkable: chipped dishes, moth-eaten quilts, stacks of unread newspapers from the 1940s. But this photograph stopped him cold. Thomas had appraised hundreds of antique photographs. He knew the conventions, the rigid postures, the unsmiling faces, the sense that sitting for a portrait was a solemn duty rather than a moment of joy. But something about this boy's expression felt different. It wasn't the usual discomfort of holding still for the long exposure times required by early cameras. It was something deeper, a kind of knowing sadness, a resignation that seemed far too heavy for someone so young. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded ink, Eleanor and James. October 14, 1900, Whitman Studio. No last name, no address, just 2 first names and a date. Thomas set the photograph aside, intending to research it later. But that evening, at his apartment in Cambridge, he found himself unable to stop thinking about the boy's eyes, that distant, haunted look. He pulled out his laptop and began searching historical records, census data, city directories, newspaper archives from turn-of-the-century Boston. What he would discover over the following weeks would reveal a secret that had remained hidden for 124 years. A secret about a mother's desperate love, a son's quiet courage, and a disease that destroyed families with ruthless efficiency. The boy in the photograph was dying, and only his mother knew. Thomas Bennett began his research the way all good investigations start, with the basics. The Whitman Studio on Tremont Street had been one of Boston's premier photography establishments between 1895 and 1910, serving middle-class families who could afford the luxury of a professional portrait. City directories from 1900 listed dozens of families with sons named James, but without a surname, Thomas needed another approach. He focused on the photograph itself. The boy's clothing suggested modest prosperity, not wealthy but respectable. The studio's pricing records, preserved in the Boston Public Library archives, indicated that a sitting cost about $2, equivalent to half a week's wages for a factory worker. This was a family that had saved for the portrait, that considered it important. Thomas enlarged a high-resolution scan of the image on his computer screen, studying every detail. The boy's face was thin, not malnourished but drawn, as if he'd recently lost weight. There was a slight darkness under his eyes. His hand, resting on his knee, appeared almost translucent in the photograph's lighting, the bones visible beneath pale skin. Then Thomas noticed something else, a small detail he'd initially missed. On the table beside the boy sat a handkerchief, carefully folded. In 1900, this would have been unremarkable. Everyone carried handkerchiefs. But the way it was positioned, so deliberately within reach, suggested it wasn't merely decorative. He cross-referenced the date, October 14, 1900, with Boston newspaper archives. The fall of 1900 had been particularly brutal for tuberculosis in the city. The Boston Globe ran almost daily obituaries of young people succumbing to consumption, as it was commonly called. The Massachusetts Department of Health had just begun implementing controversial new quarantine measures, forcing families to report cases and, in some instances, removing infected individuals to sanitariums against their will. Thomas found an article from October 8, 1900, just 6 days before the photograph was taken. Health Board warns of consumption epidemic. Families urged to report symptoms. The article listed the telltale signs: persistent cough, weight loss, night sweats, fatigue, and blood in the sputum. The handkerchief, the boy's thin face, his mother's desperate grip on his shoulder. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the pieces beginning to form a picture. If the boy had tuberculosis in October 1900, and if his mother knew, she would have been facing an impossible situation. Reporting the disease meant potential forced quarantine. It meant the family being shunned by neighbors, the father possibly losing his job, younger siblings being taken away for their safety. But keeping it secret meant living with a ticking clock, watching your child deteriorate while pretending everything was normal. Thomas opened a new search window and typed, Eleanor James Boston 1900 death records. The death records yielded nothing under those names for 1900 or 1901. Thomas expanded his search to 1902, then 1903. Still nothing. Either the boy had survived, unlikely given the mortality rate for tuberculosis in that era, or the records were incomplete, or the names on the photograph weren't their real names. That last possibility troubled him. Why would someone write false names on a family portrait? Thomas decided to approach the problem from a different angle. He contacted the Massachusetts Historical Society and requested access to their collection of early medical records. 3 days later, he sat in their reading room in downtown Boston, surrounded by leather-bound ledgers from long-defunct hospitals and sanitariums. The records were fragmentary at best. Privacy laws in 1900 were virtually non-existent, but record-keeping was haphazard. Many institutions had closed, their documents lost to fires, floods, or simple neglect. But Thomas persisted, working through admission logs from the Boston Consumptives Hospital, the Rutland State Sanatorium, and several private facilities that catered to tuberculosis patients. In a ledger from the North Reading Sanatorium, he found an entry dated November 12, 1900, exactly 1 month after the photograph was taken. Male patient, age 14, admitted with advanced pulmonary consumption. Mother accompanied patient, refused to provide surname for registry. Patient identified only as J. Critical condition upon arrival. The notation continued. Mother stated patient had been symptomatic for approximately 4 months prior to admission. Expressed guilt over delay in seeking treatment. Patient's father reportedly unaware of condition. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the page with his phone. This had to be them. The timeline matched perfectly. A 14-year-old boy, a protective mother, and a secret kept from the father. But why keep it secret for 4 months? What was Eleanor protecting or hiding from? He found a clue in another entry, dated 2 days later. Patient's mother informed staff that family faced eviction if landlord discovered consumption case in building. Requested all correspondence be sent to alternate address. Now it made sense. In 1900, Boston tuberculosis wasn't just a medical crisis. It was an economic and social catastrophe. Landlords routinely evicted families with infected members. Employers fired workers whose families were affected. Children were barred from schools. The disease carried a stigma so profound that families sometimes chose to hide it until hiding became impossible. Eleanor had watched her son deteriorate for months, knowing that seeking help meant destroying their lives, but knowing that not seeking help meant watching him die. The photograph suddenly took on new meaning. It wasn't just a family portrait. It was evidence. Proof that James had existed, had been loved, had been part of a family, before the disease forced them into the shadows. Thomas continued reading. The next entry, dated November 20th, 1900, was brief. Patient expired at 3:47 a.m. Mother present. Body released to undertaker. No service information provided. Thomas felt the weight of that final entry. Patient expired. 2 words that ended a young life, reduced to clinical notation in a sanatorium ledger. But something about the record bothered him. No surname, no forwarding address, no funeral information. It was as if Eleanor and James had simply vanished from history after that November morning. He spent the next week searching cemetery records across Boston and surrounding towns. Nothing. He checked newspaper obituaries, hundreds of them from late 1900 and early 1901. Young people died of tuberculosis so frequently that many papers relegated the notices to a few lines. James, age 14, of consumption, with no other details. But none matched the timeline or the sparse information he had. Then, while reviewing the sanatorium records again, Thomas noticed a marginal note he'd initially overlooked, written in different handwriting, added perhaps weeks or months after the boy's death. Personal effects transferred to St. Anne's Church, Salem Street, per mother's request. Letters remain in storage. St. Anne's Church. Thomas knew it, a small Catholic church in Boston's North End, built in 1887, still standing today, though now serving a different congregation. He contacted the current parish administration and explained his research. The archivist, a retired librarian named Patricia, was intrigued. "We have boxes of materials from the old parish," she told him over the phone. "Much of it was never properly cataloged. If there are letters from 1900, they'd be in the basement archives." 2 days later, Thomas met Patricia in the church basement. The space smelled of old paper and incense, lit by flickering fluorescent lights. She led him to a row of filing cabinets and wooden crates stacked against a brick wall. "Materials related to the sanatorium patients are in these boxes," Patricia explained, pulling out a container labeled 1899-1903 Pastoral Care Records. Inside were bundles of letters, tied with faded ribbon, organized by year. Thomas carefully untied a bundle marked 1900, November-December. The letters were written in elegant script on thin paper, many of them tear-stained and difficult to read. They were correspondences between patients' families and Father Michael Donnelly, the parish priest who had served as chaplain to several local sanitariums. Halfway through the stack, Thomas found them. 3 letters from Eleanor, written in the weeks before and after James's death. The first was dated October 20th, 1900, 6 days after the photograph. "Dear Father Donnelly, I write to you in desperation. My son James grows weaker each day. The cough now produces blood, and he can barely eat. I have told my husband that James is visiting his aunt in Connecticut, but I cannot maintain this deception much longer. I must take him to the sanatorium, but I fear what this will mean for our family. My husband works at the textile mill. If they discover we harbor consumption, he will lose his position. We have 3 younger children. I am torn between saving one child and destroying the lives of the others. Please pray for us. Please help me know what is right." Thomas read the letter 3 times, feeling the anguish in every word. Eleanor's handwriting grew shakier toward the end. The ink smudged in places where tears had fallen. He imagined her sitting at a kitchen table late at night, her son coughing in the next room, writing to the only person she trusted with her impossible secret. The second letter was dated November 1st, 1900. "Dear Father Donnelly, thank you for your counsel and your discretion. I have made my decision. Tomorrow I will tell my husband that James and I are traveling to Connecticut to care for my sister, who is ill. In truth, I am taking James to the North Reading Sanatorium. I have withdrawn the money we had saved for winter coal. I pray it will be enough. The doctor I consulted in secret said, James may have months, perhaps less. I cannot let him die at home, where his siblings might contract the disease, where our landlord might discover us and cast us into the street. You asked if I felt guilt for waiting so long to seek help. Father, I feel nothing but guilt. I noticed the cough in June, dismissed it as a summer cold. I saw the weight falling from him in July, told myself he was simply growing. By August I knew the truth but was too terrified to face it. I have killed my son through cowardice, and now I must live with that knowledge for the rest of my days. The photograph I had taken of us last month, I needed something to remember him as he was before the final decline. In that moment, I needed the world to see him as whole, as beautiful, as loved. I needed to freeze time before it ran out. Please continue to pray for us. I fear James knows he is dying, though we do not speak of it. He looks at me sometimes with such understanding, such forgiveness, that I cannot bear it." Thomas's throat tightened. He set the letter down carefully and looked at the photograph again, now understanding the full context of that moment captured in the studio. Eleanor gripping her son's shoulder, not in casual affection, but in desperation. James's distant gaze, not awkwardness, but the look of someone already leaving the world behind. The third letter was dated November 25th, 1900, 5 days after James's death. "Dear Father Donnelly, James is gone. He died peacefully in the early morning hours of November 20th. I was holding his hand. His last words were, 'Don't cry, Mother. You did everything you could.' But I did not do everything I could. I waited too long. I chose our family's stability over his life, and that choice haunts me. The sanatorium has agreed to keep our names confidential. My husband believes James is still in Connecticut. Tomorrow I will return home and tell him that James died suddenly of pneumonia while visiting my sister. He will never know the truth. I will carry this lie, this grief, this guilt for the rest of my life. I am burying James today in an unmarked grave in a small cemetery near the sanatorium. The director arranged it quietly to protect our family's reputation. There will be no stone, no service, no public mourning. My son will disappear from history as if he never existed. But he did exist, Father. He was kind and gentle. He loved to read. He wanted to be a teacher. He deserved better than a mother too afraid to save him. Better than a death in a sanatorium surrounded by strangers. Better than a grave no one will visit." The letter ended there, unsigned. Thomas sat in silence in the church basement, the letters spread before him on the old wooden table. Patricia stood nearby, wiping her eyes. "That poor woman," she whispered. Thomas nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand why Eleanor had written false names on the photograph. It wasn't to deceive. It was to protect. Even in creating a record of her son's existence, she couldn't risk the truth being discovered. Thomas left St. Anne's Church with high-resolution scans of Eleanor's letters, Patricia's permission to use them in his research, and a deepening commitment to finding out what had happened to the rest of the family. Eleanor's guilt was palpable in every sentence, but Thomas saw something else too. A woman who had loved her son fiercely and made impossible choices in an impossible time. The letters mentioned an unmarked grave in a small cemetery near the sanatorium. The North Reading Sanatorium had closed in 1952, its buildings demolished decades ago, replaced by a residential neighborhood. But the cemetery, if it still existed, might hold answers. Thomas drove north from Boston on a gray afternoon in late October, almost exactly 124 years after the photograph was taken. The landscape had transformed completely. Where there had once been rural sanatorium grounds, there were now subdivisions, a shopping center, and a public park. He spent 2 hours searching, consulting old survey maps on his phone, comparing them to the modern terrain. Finally, behind an overgrown hedge at the edge of the park, he found it. A small, forgotten burial ground, perhaps 30 graves marked with simple stones, many tilted or broken. A rusted iron fence surrounded the plot, partially collapsed. A historical marker, weathered and barely legible, read, "North Reading Sanatorium Cemetery, 1896-1921. Resting place of tuberculosis patients treated at the North Reading Sanatorium." Thomas walked among the graves, reading names and dates. Most died young, teenagers, young adults, occasionally children. The stones were modest, some bearing only initials and years. Many were completely illegible, the inscriptions worn away by time and weather. He photographed each marker systematically, searching for any clue that might lead to James. Near the back corner, beneath a large oak tree, he found a section of particularly small, simple stones. These were the unmarked or minimally marked graves, people buried with little ceremony, their identities protected or simply forgotten. One stone caught his attention. It was slightly newer than the others, placed perhaps decades after the original burial. The inscription was simple, J, November 1900, beloved son. Thomas knelt beside it. Could this be James? Had someone, Eleanor perhaps, years later, returned to mark the grave she'd been forced to leave anonymous? He took several photographs, then sat on the ground beside the stone, feeling the weight of the story settling over him. If this was James, then his mother had come back. Despite her guilt, despite her fear, despite the years that had passed, she'd found a way to honor him, even if only with an initial and a date. But Thomas still had questions. What had happened to Eleanor after James's death? Had she maintained the lie with her husband? Had she told her other children the truth? And why had she kept the photograph, knowing it was evidence of a secret she desperately tried to bury? He needed to find Eleanor's family. If any of her other children had survived, if there were descendants, they deserved to know this story. They deserved to know about James, about Eleanor's sacrifice, about the impossible choice she'd made. Thomas stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and pulled out his phone. He had census records to search, city directories to comb through, genealogical databases to explore. He'd found James's grave. Now he needed to find Eleanor's truth. Back in his Cambridge apartment, Thomas attacked the genealogical research with renewed focus. Eleanor's letters had mentioned 3 younger children and a husband who worked at a textile mill. In 1900 Boston, there were several major textile operations, but the largest was the Washington Mills on Border Street in East Boston. He started with the 1900 census, searching for families with the right configuration: husband, wife, and 4 children, with the oldest being a teenage son. He cross-referenced with city directories listing mill workers. It took 47 hours of meticulous searching, but finally, he found them. The household appeared in the census taken in June 1900, 4 months before James died. Michael Brennan, age 38, textile worker. Eleanor Brennan, age 35, housewife. James Brennan, age 14. Margaret Brennan, age 11. Thomas Brennan, age 8. Catherine Brennan, age 5. Brennan. That was the surname Eleanor had hidden from the sanatorium, from the church, from the photograph's inscription. Thomas felt a surge of adrenaline. He had their full names now. He could trace their entire story. He immediately searched forward in time. The 1910 census showed the family at the same East Boston address, but with a critical difference. Michael Brennan, age 48, textile worker. Eleanor Brennan, age 45, housewife. Margaret Brennan, age 21, seamstress. Thomas Brennan, age 18, dock worker. Catherine Brennan, age 15, student. James was absent, as expected, but the family had survived. Michael still worked at the mill. The children had grown up. To the outside world, they were ordinary, unremarkable working-class Bostonians. Thomas dug deeper, searching for death records. He found Michael Brennan's obituary from 1923. He died of a heart attack at age 61, leaving behind his beloved wife Eleanor and 3 children. The obituary made no mention of a 4th child. James had been erased from the family's public history. Eleanor lived longer. Thomas found her death certificate from 1941 at age 76. She'd died at home with her daughter Margaret present. The cause was listed as natural causes, old age. Thomas paused, staring at the document. Eleanor had lived 41 years after James's death. 4 decades carrying that secret, that guilt, that grief. Had she ever told anyone the full truth? Had she confided in her daughters as they grew older? Or had she taken the complete story to her grave? He needed to find Eleanor's descendants. Margaret had married in 1912. Her marriage certificate showed her maiden name as Brennan, confirming the connection. She'd had 2 children. Thomas traced the family tree forward through marriages and births, deaths and relocations. The trail led him to a woman named Jennifer Collins, Eleanor's great-great-granddaughter, living in Somerville, just outside Boston. According to social media profiles, Jennifer was in her early 50s, worked as a school librarian, and had an interest in genealogy. Thomas drafted a careful email explaining his research, attaching scans of the photograph and explaining what he'd discovered. He hit send, then waited. 3 hours later, his phone rang. "Mr. Bennett?" The voice was shaky, emotional. "This is Jennifer Collins. I just read your email. I had no idea. No one in our family ever mentioned a brother named James. We always thought Eleanor had 3 children, not 4. Thomas met Jennifer Collins at a cafe in Davis Square 3 days later. She arrived carrying a worn leather satchel, her hands trembling slightly as she shook his hand. She was a petite woman with graying hair and Eleanor's eyes. That same intensity Thomas had noticed in the photograph. "I've been going through family documents since you contacted me," Jennifer said, pulling folders from her satchel before even sitting down. "My grandmother, Margaret's daughter, left me boxes of papers when she passed. I never went through them carefully, but last night I found this." She placed a small journal on the table between them. The cover was faded green cloth, the pages yellowed and brittle. On the first page, in careful handwriting, "Private Thoughts of Eleanor Brennan, 1920. Thomas felt his heart rate quicken. "You found Eleanor's diary?" "Not exactly a diary," Jennifer explained. "More like a confession. She wrote it when she was 55 years old, 20 years after James died. I think she needed to document the truth before she forgot the details, or before she died without anyone knowing." She opened the journal to a marked page and began to read aloud. "I have decided to write this account while my memory is still clear and my hand steady. I am 55 years old. My son James would have been 34 this year. He has been gone for 2 decades, but I think of him every single day. Michael died last month, never knowing the truth about where James went. I told him our son died of pneumonia while visiting family in Connecticut. Michael grieved, but he never questioned the story. Perhaps he sensed that some truths are too painful to examine closely. My daughters, Margaret, Catherine, and young Thomas, remember James only vaguely. They were so young when he died. I told them the same story I told Michael. They accepted it without question, and I have maintained that lie for 20 years. But I am tired of lying. I am tired of carrying this alone." Jennifer's voice cracked. She paused, wiping her eyes. "There's more." She describes everything. The diagnosis, the decision to hide it, taking him to the sanatorium. She writes about watching him die, about burying him in secret, about coming home and pretending he'd died somewhere else. Thomas leaned forward. "Does she explain why she kept it secret even after Michael died?" Jennifer nodded and turned several pages. "Here, this is from later in the journal. People have asked me why I never told the truth after Michael passed, why I continued the deception even when there was no risk of him losing his job, no danger of us being evicted. The answer is shame. Not shame about James having consumption. That could have happened to anyone. Shame about my choices. I waited 4 months to get him help. 4 months watching him deteriorate because I was afraid. How do I tell my other children that I chose their stability over their brother's life? How do I tell them that James might have survived if I'd acted sooner? So I stayed silent. I let James disappear from our family history, and now, 2 decades later, my grandchildren are being born into a world where James never existed. This is his monument then, these pages, the only place where the truth lives." The cafe around them seemed to fade away. Thomas and Jennifer sat in silence, both absorbing the weight of Eleanor's words. Finally, Jennifer spoke. She loved him. That's what comes through on every page. She loved him desperately, and she made the best choice she could with the impossible options she had. Thomas nodded. In 1900, there was no good choice. Report the disease and destroy your family. Hide it and watch your child die. She chose to protect the living, even though it meant sacrificing the dead. "There's one more thing," Jennifer said quietly. She turned to the journal's final entry, dated 1940, 1 year before Eleanor's death. "I am 75 years old and know I have little time left. Tomorrow, Margaret is taking me to North Reading. I have told her I wish to visit the old countryside. In truth, I am returning to James. I had a stone placed on his grave years ago, just an initial and a date, because even now I cannot risk the full truth, but I need to see it one more time. I need to tell him I'm sorry. I need to tell him that he was loved, that he mattered, that he was never forgotten. And perhaps when I die, I will see him again, and he will forgive me for what I could not do in life." Jennifer closed the journal carefully, her hands trembling. She did go back, and she had the stone placed. "That must be the one you found with just J, and the date." Thomas pulled out his phone and showed Jennifer the photographs he'd taken at the cemetery. She stared at the small stone marker for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. "All these years," she whispered, "and none of us knew. My grandmother Margaret never mentioned it. My mother never knew she had a great-uncle named James. It's like he was completely erased." "Not completely," Thomas said gently. "Eleanor made sure he wasn't. The photograph, the journal, the stone. She left breadcrumbs for someone to find eventually." Jennifer looked up at him. But why? If she wanted the truth known, why not just tell her daughters? Thomas had been thinking about this question since reading Eleanor's letters, because the truth would have forced them to confront an impossible moral question. Would you have done things differently if you were in Eleanor's position? There's no right answer. She protected them from having to judge her choices by keeping those choices hidden. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Jennifer said, "I want to go there, to the cemetery, to James's grave. Can you take me?" 2 days later, Thomas and Jennifer stood together in the forgotten burial ground behind the overgrown hedge in North Reading. The October afternoon was cool and overcast, the oak trees blazing with autumn color. Jennifer knelt beside the small stone marked Jade November 1900, "Beloved son." She placed her hand on the weathered granite. "I'm sorry we didn't know about you, James. I'm sorry you were forgotten, but you're not forgotten anymore." Thomas watched as she pulled something from her bag, a small brass picture frame. Inside was a printed copy of the 1900 photograph, Eleanor and James, mother and son, captured in that moment of terrible knowledge and desperate love. Jennifer carefully propped the frame against the headstone. "Now you have a face," she said softly. "Now you're real again." As they stood there, Thomas's phone buzzed. It was an email from Patricia at St. Anne's Church. She'd found something else in the archives, a letter Eleanor had written to Father Donnelly in 1939, near the end of her life. Thomas read it aloud to Jennifer. "Dear Father Donnelly, I am an old woman now, and my time grows short. I write to thank you for keeping my secret all these years. You never judged me. You never told me I was wrong. You simply held my pain with compassion, and for that I am grateful. I want you to know that I made peace with my choices. James understood. Even at 14, dying in that sanatorium, he understood that I was trying to protect his siblings. His last words to me were not accusations, but forgiveness. I have carried his forgiveness with me for 39 years. It has been both my burden and my salvation. When I am gone, if anyone ever discovers the truth, I hope they will understand that love is not always enough. That sometimes love means making choices that break your own heart to protect the hearts of others. James was my son. He will always be my son. And someday soon, I will see him again." Jennifer wiped her eyes. She did make peace with it. Thomas nodded. As much as anyone could. They stayed at the grave for another hour. Jennifer telling James about the family he never knew, the nieces and nephews, the great-grandchildren, the life that had continued without him but had always, in some hidden way, included him. 3 months later, Thomas stood in a small gallery space in Cambridge, watching people examine the exhibition he had curated. The centerpiece was the 1900 photograph of Eleanor and James, enlarged and professionally restored, mounted beside the text of Eleanor's letters and journal entries. The exhibition was titled, "Hidden in Plain Sight, A Mother's Secret, A Son's Memory." Jennifer had given permission to share the story publicly, believing that Eleanor would have wanted the truth told, just not during her lifetime, when it could still hurt the people she loved. Thomas watched a mother and teenage son stop in front of the photograph. The boy read the placard explaining James's story, then looked at his mother. She put her arm around his shoulders, pulling him close, just as Eleanor had done 124 years earlier. "It's so sad," the boy said. "She must have felt so guilty." His mother nodded. She did what she thought was right. Sometimes there are no good choices, only the choice you can live with. Thomas smiled. That was exactly the point. Eleanor's story wasn't about judgment. It was about the impossible complexity of love and sacrifice. Jennifer approached, carrying a folder. "I thought you'd want to see this," I found James's birth certificate. His full name was James Michael Brennan, born March 15th, 1886. Thomas took the document carefully. James now had a complete identity, a name, a birth date, a death date, a grave, a photograph, and a story. He's not forgotten anymore, Jennifer said quietly. No, Thomas agreed. He's not. That evening, as Thomas locked up the gallery, he looked one last time at the photograph. Eleanor's hand on James's shoulder, his distant gaze. Two people sharing a devastating secret, frozen in time. The photograph had kept its secret for 124 years, but now, finally, the truth was visible. Not just the truth about tuberculosis and tragedy, but the deeper truth about a mother's impossible love, a son's quiet courage, and the secrets families carry across generations. James existed. He mattered. He was loved. And now, finally, he was remembered.